Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's webinar organized by Funds for NGOs. Today's topic is Strategic NGO Project Proposals for Global Impact. I am Anutma and I'm here to facilitate this session. First of all, I want to thank each one of you for joining us. This webinar will run for 60 minutes, which includes 45 minutes of presentation, followed by a 15 minutes of Q&A session. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A option on your webinar screen to post your question, and we will respond to them during the Q&A session. Let's begin with webinar's objective. The first objective is to understand key stages and components of a sustainable development project, to align project goals with sustainability principles and development frameworks like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, to structure and present strong project proposals that appeal to funders and stakeholders, to share project ideas and receive constructive feedback and refine them for greater impact. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available in the video section of the Funds for NGOs premium website. And now allow me to introduce today's trainer, Dr. Christopher A. Johnson. Dr. Christopher is an award-winning journalist, editor, publisher, and business management consultant since the 1980s. He is also a former Commonwealth Nuffield Cambridge Press Fellow, Management Science Fellow, a certified Commonwealth Youth Worker, holder of an MBA in Marketing Management and a doctorate in Business Management. He is renowned for his tutorials in bid writing, business planning, leadership, marketing, and organizational development cum capacity building. He is both founding director of Global Entrepreneurial Development Services Limited and chair of Community Education Academy of Leadership. He supports economic and social policy initiatives in Africa, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and South Asia. Now, I kindly request Dr. Christopher to lead the session and share screen.
Thank you very much, ma'am, and again, let me take this opportunity to welcome all of you to this webinar, a very important webinar, as most webinars are. And today we would be looking at strategic NGO project proposals for global impact. This presentation will address a number of issues ranging from what are global development goals, setting project objectives, impact planning, how you go about formulating a budget, monitoring and evaluation, writing robust proposals, finding the right funders, and more importantly, how you build sustainability. And so let us get into the presentation. I hope everyone is well today, as we should be. And I'm sure that you will find this presentation very informative as well as interesting. So first of all, let us establish what are the developing goals. The developing goals are really the successor of the Millennium Development Goals that were established in 2000, just after the world became another century, so to speak. And so if you look on your screen, you would see that the developing goals are defined in relation to long-term objectives, or what we call long-range planning and development. They also include aspects of cultural, economic, and social development. Of course, environmental issues are also pivotal to this particular set of goals. But these goals were developed in order to create a more planning arrangement regarding policy, and also to create partnerships across public, private, and civic sector organizations The goals were also designed to measure progress or to monitor and evaluate. So you have to assess, evaluate, and then conduct what is called post-ante evaluation. That is tracking your project when that project comes to an end or when the funding concludes. There are some very useful examples of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are those around alleviating poverty or material poverty, because when we talk about poverty, sometimes we are not specific. But here we are talking about material poverty, people unable to have access to employment opportunities, thus depriving them of what we call their daily bread. Quality education, this is about training and development. Gender equality, this is not just about women's development, but is also about empowering young girls and even empowering young boys who are struggling at the moment across the globe. And then again, we look at the weather patterns, changing weather patterns, which create what is called climate justice or climate activism. And so one of the important goals of the United Nations, of course, is to ensure that NGOs and other organizations are involved in reducing carbon emissions and making a contribution towards the improvement of weather pattern conditions, etc., making sure that systems are in place. Why are these goals relevant to non-governmental organizations such as ours? Well, because they are in sync or they align with the actions of global organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, the Commonwealth, and other international bodies. These goals are also designed to boost or strengthen or increase the capacity of organizations so that they can have access or they can attract donors, sometimes regarded as donor appeal. And more importantly, as I mentioned in my opening statement, they're also designed to create a monitoring and evaluation platform upon which NGOs can measure the impact or the effects of not just funding, but their own involvement in their respective communities. So by and large, development goals are designed to ensure that organizations function according to the funding requirements and that they reflect global imperatives or necessities. We have, of course, gone down this route before, talking about setting objectives, but it is important to go over them again. In adult education, it is said repetition is good for emphasis. Setting clear objectives is not something that can be done easily. It demands a thought process that can take sometimes weeks, months, years, depending on the extent of the project. In any case, however, this is a methodical and systematic approach to setting objectives. First of all, you have to define what the objectives are. You have to ensure that those objectives are clearly defined. There's a schedule or a time frame or parameter within which those objectives are set, whether it is for 4 years, 5 years, 6 months, or even 3 months. Of course, the purpose behind objective setting is to make sure that the activities and events that you plan are conducted or carried out in a way that suits your beneficiaries, your service users. They also have to be in collaboration with the organization and external bodies, be they public sector organizations or private sector. There are some very important features or sometimes regarded as characteristics of objective setting. We hear about SMART objectives, we hear about all kinds of different objective setting, but this is something that came into being in the 1990s. even though they have been around since the 1980s, but in terms of management, business management and quality management, we now have SMART objectives. These are objectives that are specific or related to a particular set of projects. They are measurable. In other words, they can be assessed and evaluated. Objectives have to be realistic as well. In other words, they have to be based on evidence, what is sometimes regarded as needs analysis or needs analyses. In the case of many projects, they have to be relevant. In other words, they have to relate to what you're trying to achieve. And then, of course, they have to be delivered according to schedule, according to contract specification or deadlines set by donors or funders. Setting objectives also involve making sure that you have best value. So quality is very important here. The way you engage with your partners, your alliances, your stakeholders is very important. And of course, the way you understand the value of aligning the needs of the community with the work of this United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and how you actually break down these goals into milestones. So, for example, you might decide to look at the SDG around education. You have to then break down those activities according to what you're trying to accomplish. You might be looking at training young people, women, young girls, and a number of other people who are excluded from the system. And so you might decide to do it over the next 2 or 3 months. Those are regarded as milestones. And so why objectives are important for NGOs? In fact, they are not just important for NGOs, but they're also important for all nonprofit organizations. It is important that we are clear. In other words, we are not ambiguous. We are providing information that is understandable, intelligible, readable, information that is very, not too simplistic, but the language should be clear to us. It is also important that we reflect in our application what donors are looking for. So we focus on donor requirements. Whatever the donor conditions are, we should really include them in our objectives. And more importantly, make sure that we have a proper impact assessment in place, not just monitoring and evaluation, but we also have situations where people can give informal feedback. They can do what is called video diaries. They can also, you can gain evidence through group discussion, individual contributions, and even stakeholders external to the NGO can also be part of the objective setting. So setting clear objectives is a very important aspect of project proposal, whether those proposals are being developed or they're being implemented. Engaging stakeholders is of importance to all NGOs, locally, nationally, regionally, internationally, because engaging stakeholders require experience, it requires skills, it requires competence, it requires the ability to understand people, understand human nature, understand the body politics of these organizations, and more or less understanding what is it the stakeholders are trying to accomplish, what is it they want from you, what is it they need, the needs are. And so the purpose behind engaging stakeholders is to make them feel confident, let them feel trustworthy, let them respect what you do so that they can collaborate with you. And of course, it is important to understand what stakeholders are doing in the local area. So for example, We might have a commercial bank sponsoring the building of a faith organization, a mosque, a church, a gurdwara, a mandir, or a temple. But that organization is also involved in funding other local organizations. And so understanding what the stakeholders are doing within that local area is very important in relation to outcomes and outputs. And then, of course, you have different types of stakeholders. You have those who are part of your volunteering staff, those who are part of the administrative staff, supervisory staff, those who are board members or trustees or directors in the case of companies, and they are regarded as people who are internal. In other words, they are within the organization. And then you have those outside the organization or external to the organization. These are people who benefit, they are service users, they are clients, they are those who contribute towards funding you. And then you have people within the community who are pastoral leaders, people who are advocates and activists. And then, of course, you have government entities, could be local government, municipalities, or even government departments, all of whom or all of which are regarded as stakeholders. And then you have your key strategies in place. We talked about needs analysis, mapping the needs of organizations and individuals. If you're dealing with elderly people, for example, you need to understand something about their circumstances, their social status. Obviously, they may not be working, but they can be working as volunteers, or they can serve as volunteers. You may need to also understand their health situation. If they have chronic illnesses or conditions, how you actually engage with them. And so it is important to, at the beginning of your project proposal, to engage with your clients, your stakeholders very early. Don't wait until you actually propose the project before you engage with them. Engage with them long before you've done that, so that you could include them in your proposal. Be very sensitive to individuals, people who have different language barriers. You can either speak slowly or deliberately, or even if you have translations, make sure that those translations are accessible to the different individuals with the different community language speakers, etc. I wish to emphasize that in engaging stakeholders, NGOs must always try to develop accountability measures. How do they go about doing that? Well, make sure that you have a proper profile on your website. If you have a prospectus is a business set of proposals you have. Make sure that those proposals are accurate in terms of numbers and information. Make sure that you develop partnerships with stakeholders. You share resources with them. You discuss documents such as memorandum of understanding so that you can develop a very good partnership arrangement. And once more, make sure that you measure the impact of the stakeholders. For example, how many stakeholders, the type of stakeholders you have, the nature of the relationship, and more importantly, what is it you're trying to accomplish working with one or more stakeholders. And so in conclusion here, engaging stakeholders is a top priority, or it should be a top priority of NGOs if they are to accomplish any form of success for their projects and organizations. The Bridgespan Group This is a group that has international standing, and every now and then it provides a snapshot of how non-charity, or sorry, how charitable organizations should be measuring their planning. And so the first thing that you need to identify is the kind of task or tasks. So you need to scope that. You need to find out what is it you're trying to achieve, who are the people involved, who will be the decision makers. Obviously, the decision makers will not only be your trustees and external stakeholders, but also the people who use your service. So you need to get them involved, and then you engage your stakeholders by identifying how they will be involved in the planning uh, process, how you will engage them, what method would you use to engage them? Would you engage them on social media? Would you engage them through writing of letters, attending briefing sessions? All of these ways and means you have to consider. How would you go about clarifying strategy? What choices would you make to make sure that people are involved, and who would be involved in this planning process? How many people you want to be involved? What is the cost of getting them involved in the process? And of course, once you clarify your strategy, once the strategy is clear, you then have to ask yourself, what kind of objectives will I set? How could I explain in very clear terms what is it I'm trying to accomplish as an NGO? What ideas I need from external sources to input into my planning process? Do I have enough money? Do I have enough paisa, chitna? Do I have enough funds to assist me? Do I have the skill sets within the organization and without? Do I need to buy in competent people to make sure that our priorities are clear? All of these things need to be looked at. And then how would you manage expectations? Because when you're planning a project or projects, you have to manage the expectations of your organization, managing expectations of external stakeholders, and managing the expectations of your clients or service users. And all of these things impact on your planning mechanism. So before you start planning, always make sure that you sit down with your team and come up with ideas that are comparable or that can relate with what you're trying to accomplish, what your stakeholders are thinking about, and what is it you're trying to achieve in terms of funding. This is quite interesting because this was a project that we were able to win. In fact, we were able to win a small bid for one of our organizations in England. And this is a local authority that has asked for the organization to do what is called a financial monitoring analysis. And so what we did really was to look at the entire funding profile of the project and break it down into several quarters. And since the project is going to be done over a 6-month period, we broke down every item of expenditure according to the contract specification or the contract value, and then break them down into quarters to show the amount over for the next three to 6 months. So this is a typical example of what you need to do when you're planning your project. You need to sit down very carefully and analyze what is it you're trying to do. So for example, the training facilitator and training materials, those cost heads reflect the kind of training workshops that will be conducted, the kind of advice and guidance that will be given to trainees or beneficiaries or participants. The venue hire, this is where you actually hire venues. You pay for different places. It can be community centers. It could be community halls or faith organizations. You pay them a small fee to hire a space or spaces. Refreshments, this is about drinks and light refreshments, a bit of food or snacks. The coordinator, of course, would be the person who runs the program. He or she is responsible for supervising, administering, and making sure that every project activity is carried out to specification. And then you have the administration. This is the person who does the paperwork, manage the website, send out correspondence, and liaise with the coordinator and volunteer. Traveling, of course, this is where people sometimes have difficulty in managing traveling. They may not have sufficient funds. And so if they spend their own money, it can be reimbursed. In some instances, you can budget for travel expenses for people who live in villages or remote areas of the country. Of course, if you're dealing with technology, you need to have licenses. So there is a cost there for software licenses for over the funding period. Then you have your marketing or your public relations, your monitoring and evaluation. And if you have young people with childcare, people who have young children, you need to put aside some money for childcare subsidies. Most times you can allocate money for about 3 to 6 individuals. You can't allocate money for everyone who has a child or children. But by and large, this is what you need to do when you are presenting a financial monitoring analysis. You need to be very clear on what is it you're trying to accomplish in relation to funding, etc. And all of these would be in your contract specification, as you know. We spoke at length about monitoring and evaluation, and this is very, very crucial. I want to spend some time looking at this because my own experience as a consultant, as a bid writer, and as a trainer, my experience over the last 35 years has shown that many NGOs fail to do proper monitoring, fail to do pre-evaluation, fail to prepare on how to evaluate their projects, and so they get themselves in a twist. Tracking progress or measuring progress, measuring events and activities is a very critical, if not crucial, part of your project proposal. And so when you are defining your project, you need to make sure that you understand the various steps that you need to take. And so if we go through this here, you will see that this is a project that is supposed to last for about 6 months. This is just a typical example of a 6-month project. This will be called a short-term project. And so your planning process has to be very, very defined, very clear. It has to be absolute. In other words, it must not be complex or complicated. It must not be difficult. Once you begin to plan, you then begin to strategize. You put systems in place as to how you will go about delivering the project. Once you are satisfied with the way how you begin to scope the project, you then look at how you are going to engage stakeholders. This is something we discussed, I think, 2 previous slides, but it's worth repeating here because then we are tracking progress. You engage your stakeholders, you develop partnership agreements. Those partnership agreements would specify who will be doing what, when, why, where, and how. The 5 serving masters or mistresses of project management, the 4 W's, and the 1 H. And then where would you obtain your resources from? How would you go about recruiting individuals to the project? You may need an administrator. You may need a supervisor. You may need a data controller. You may need a community researcher, all of whom you can find in your volunteer database in your communities or your country. Once you identify who you want to recruit, then you have to look at the kind of funding, the value of funding you require. Some people say, well, look, I'd like to have 20,000, 30,000, without understanding that they need to do what is called a mapping within the organization to find out what resources exist, human, material, technical, as well as financial. Once you've established your resources and once you can pull together or mobilize your resources, you then begin a campaign, a marketing campaign, advertising and promotion campaign. And then you have to decide what channels of information and communication you will employ or deploy. Will you use social media? Would you use WhatsApp group chats? Would you use Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube? So you have a wide assortment of channels of information or media to use, but you need to utilize those that are popular with individuals, those that can be accessible to people, and of course you have to make sure that they're passworded. In other words, they're protected, they're safeguarded. People's data are protected as well. And then you have your external engagement with people within the community, your faith organizations, your health centers, your schools, your universities, your apprentice centers, chambers of commerce, voluntary umbrella organizations. All of these are very important to engage. And so in doing so, you will organize a series of events. You can either be an organizer or a co-organizer. In other words, you're working in partnership with various organizations to make sure that they know about your project. And again, tracking progress, monitoring and evaluation. How will you evaluate your project? If it's a health awareness project, as this Gantt chart typifies, how will you monitor people's health and well-being, especially if you're doing a project that is non-clinical? In other words, it's not associated with medicine or any other aspect of health within the National Health Service. So these are some of the questions you need to ask yourself when you are putting together a project. And the Gantt chart is a very simple approach. There is something called log progression. The log progression is simple, similar to the Gantt chart, but the Gantt chart simplifies each activity over a particular funding period. And I know some of you may ask questions about this, so I will certainly reserve some of my answers on that occasion. But the Gantt chart is certainly one of the most internationally renowned processes that you can use for evaluation, implementation, and delivery of projects from time to time. I'm sure that some of you are very interested in how to go about writing proposals that are robust. You know, we describe them as strong, but rarely it's about quality proposals. There's no such thing as strong or weak proposals. They're proposals, but those proposals have to be of a high standard. In other words, they have to reflect what the funders require. And again, going back to the basics, this slide here suggests there are a number of elements involved in writing proposals. There are areas of how you describe them. We've given you examples as well. And then we provided you impacts on how you actually go about monitoring. And so the first thing that you do is to develop a problem statement. This is not just for academic purposes, but also for projects. Once you analyze what the problem is, you then begin to craft a project proposal that is second to none, that is potentially winnable. In other words, proposals that would attract or entice donors and funders. And there are some examples. So for example, you might be looking at a project targeting young girls who are playing truant, who are delinquent, who are early school leavers. They may have lots of issues because they live in the rural areas. They may not have sufficient water supply. They may not be able to access health facilities. And so because of that, they are struggling. They may come from families who are materially impoverished or poor. And so you have to understand what the issues are and come up with a project that will meet their expectations or their needs. And then if you're doing what is called objective setting, again, you might decide, okay, in order to reduce the amount of dropout rates among girls, I need to increase their enrollment in schools by over a third in the next 2 years. And then you begin to align your objectives with the donor priorities, quality education. And that, of course, would increase the chances of the youngsters. And then your method, how would you go about developing a method to help to deliver the project? Your method can be monthly workshops. That's every 4 weeks. You might decide to train a number of teachers, nearly 4 dozen teachers in the 6 months of the program. And then in terms of your budget, you might decide to allocate hundreds of dollars for training materials or instruction materials and thousands of dollars for field visits. This is where you go and visit what the youngsters are doing, visit what volunteers are doing, etc. And then you're monitoring. Again, you will conduct surveys. You'll be talking to the youngsters, looking at what work they've done. They might be making notes. You can use that as the basis for feedback. You might have attendance registers, where they put their names and they put a mark, and you can use that to actually assess and evaluate what's happening. Stakeholder engagement, again, you might decide to set up a special project committee to advise you on the project. And members of that committee can come from local organizations within your community or within your region or country. And of course, you need to have a plan for the future. Your plan can be that you plan to train local teachers to sustain the program. Those teachers can be volunteers. They could be volunteer teachers who are given basic training in how to instruct and train young women or young people. And then finally, making sure that whatever you write is simplified. Not simplistic, but simplified. In other words, for people to understand. You use bullet points, short sentences, like the way we've used it on this table, and you avoid too much jargon, too much vocabulary. So instead of talking about ethical principles, you talk about value or values. Rather than using ethics, you use values, for example. But these are some of the suggestions I would put to you regarding writing strong proposals. They've worked for me as a consultant. They've worked for me with a charity that I have, that I manage, and they've worked for organizations that I'm a director of. And they've worked for so many different NGOs around the world. We're coming towards the end of the presentation. And again, we've looked at this in some detail in previous webinars, but it's worth repeating that finding the right funders is like a needle in a haystack sometimes. But again, there's steps you need to take, and I've identified 6 steps. One is that you need to say what the project is. You need to research your funders. You need to comprehend what the interests of the funders are. What is it they're trying to accomplish? You need to understand what type of evaluation you need to conduct. You also need to build and rebuild relationship with funders across the board. Attend meetings, network with them, speak to them, invite them to lunch or even dinner or breakfast. Have breakfast, develop a breakfast club, for example, and invite donors to attend the club. Let volunteers volunteer their service and tailor your proposal to meet the funder's priorities. In other words, make sure that whatever you've written on the piece of paper reflects what the funders are thinking about. And these are just some of the examples that you can actually apply. And finally, how do you go about building sustainability? Well, you have to be objective. You have to outline your activities and your outputs. So every activity or event you have in your proposal has to have an objective or a purpose or an aim. The activities have to be very clear. They have to be measurable by percentage and numbers. And you also have to have outputs that are quantifiable. In other words, the numbers must add up. But they can only add up if you have a strong needs analysis in place. So building sustainability, ladies and gentlemen, is a Herculean task, but it's something that NGOs should try to do from project design stage to the stage of advocacy. And so what did we discuss today? We discussed or we defined what are global development objectives. We looked at how objectives should be set. We looked at how we should engage our stakeholders, how we measure planning, how it impacts on organizations. We looked at financial monitoring, evaluation, developing proposals that can stand up to scrutiny, in other words, quality proposals, how you go about researching funders. And then finally, we looked at how to develop a sustainable base for your organization beyond project funding. I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation today. And at this time, I'd like to avail myself to any questions you wish to ask. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Dr. Christopher, for your insightful presentation.
Most
Participants, please send in your questions so that we can take up in this webinar. The first question is, how can NGOs ensure their project proposals align with global development priorities like the SDGs while still addressing local needs?
Yes, the first thing that you need to establish in order to understand the international priorities, you first of all need to know what the priorities are, and that is where research comes in. And so you go on the United Nations website, or you type in Google search engine or Yahoo or Scientific Commons or one of the search engines, and you type in SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals. There will be a number of web pages coming up. And so you click on one of them and you go to the United Nations page or pages, and then you start to read very carefully what the development goals are. You need to study them carefully, and then you can look and see whether those goals reflect what your organization is doing. In the case of climate action, if you're doing a project on environmental resilience, you need to know what climate action means according to the United Nations. If you're doing something around environmental resilience, again, you need to find out what goal or goals reflect your priorities. So it's all about knowing, and that knowledge has to come from within the organization. And that is where you need your coordinator or your administrator, or sometimes people appoint public relations officers or information officers who have specialist skills in information gathering. But at all times, do your research. And once you do that, you'll be able to find out which goal or goals you can align with your priorities for your project. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for your input. The next question is participant is saying, thank you very much. You talked about building relationship with funders, but most of the time we are not living in the same areas as them. Even on their website, they do not put their phone numbers. What is the best way of building relationships with donors who are abroad?
Yes, well, not putting your phone number is something that people talk about quite a lot. When I was in India and recently in East Africa, NGOs were talking about that as well. I think it's important to, first of all, do research on donors that are professional, donors that have credibility, the donors that have been funding NGOs for many years, donors that work with governments, donors that work with international organizations. In other words, look for individual organizations that are, as we say, kosher. In other words, they can stand up to scrutiny, they're reputable, they are recognized, they are popular with NGOs, and they are interested in the development and growth and sustainability of NGOs. And so it may take time for you to develop that rapport or that relationship, but you need to read about what they do, write to them, respond to them on emails where they have a page called message or information. Congratulate them if they have done something well for NGOs, write them and talk to them. Start the conversation. Don't just talk to them about funding. Talk about the work they do. So you show an interest at the beginning, and that is how you develop relationships. And that is what I would say to you guys. Do your research, dig and dig and dig, and don't give up because you do two or three searches and you don't find anything. Keep on digging because it's in your interest to be able to find information that is comparable to the work you're doing as an NGO.
Thank you,
Thank
Doctor, for your
you.
input. The next question is some donor proposal templates, RFP template, use jargons in preparing our proposals. How do we stick to using simple language while demonstrating undertaking of the RFP?
The simple thing is to read, 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 read. That's all I can say. Reading is very important. I read every day. I read all kinds of materials. Sometimes I even read novels in order to understand the change of language and tone. You now have social media where people are texting, and texting is becoming a problem because people are not using words anymore in a way that is acceptable. Everyone is synopsizing or praising information, and that is creating a problem. So, if you are a reputable NGO, if you want to run an organization in a proper way, you have to read. You have to read, you have to listen, you have to go to seminars and workshops. Ask questions as well. Many NGOs don't ask questions. Someone tells them something, they accept it. Break those cultural barriers that you have as an NGO and be more open-minded, broad-minded, And I think once you cultivate or recultivate those attitudes, you'll be able to understand what donors are trying to do. Also, read reports and evaluations of donors. I do that quite a lot. Every now and then, I read about what the Red Cross is doing. I read about what the United Nations is doing. I read their reports because I need to know what's happening. So don't wait on people to give you information. Use your social media, contacts, etc. Use the government channels that you have, or even if you don't have it, seek to have it. So the term here is, research, 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 research. Thank you.
Thank you for your input, Doctor. The next question is, how do you ensure sustainability when there's conflict among the organization's team?
Well, you need to make sure that first of all you have a conflict avoidance system in place. In other words, you need to be able to, as the head of your NGO, as a trustee, to detect where problems lie. And this is where you need to develop an understanding of human beings, human nature, the cultures, because even though you may come from a same culture or same faith, people think differently, and you have to prepare to accept that. You have to prepare to accept differences of opinion. Like families. Families always differ. Not everyone you can please. But the important thing is to look at what you're trying to accomplish. Always focus on the prize. And the prize is to succeed, not to fail, to succeed. And if you have people within your organization that are not interested in progress, you need to find a way to get rid of them. If you can't work with them, use the laws and the bylaws you have in your charity to remove them from office or what have you. Uh, However, if they have contacts within the community, find a way in which you can work with them. Maybe they have vested interests. Maybe you can work with them in that way to be able to resolve some of the problems. But always find ways and means to resolve problems. Always look for solutions, practical solutions, not solutions that are pie in the sky. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for your input. The next question is, how does one ensure that M&E is given the priority it deserves with limited capacity within an organization and limited resources to hire the right expertise?
Could you reread the question again because it's very loaded?
All right. How does one ensure that
Mhm.
M&E is given the priority it deserves with limited capacity within an organization and limited resources to hire the right expertise?
I'm reading the question as the person is asking, how do you manage with limited capacity or limited resources? I think the word limited came up twice, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
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 I think I've attempted to answer this question on a few occasions on this platform, and I'll repeat by saying that uh, if you conduct continuously a needs analysis within and without the organization, you'll be able able to overcome the limited resources you have. Resources are divided into about three or four strands. You have human resources. That's the first, that's the most precious resource that you need. Then you have technical resources. These resources are based on the professional skills that people have. And then you have quality resources. This is where resources are defined in terms of high value, low value, lesser value. This is about risk. And then you have financial resources. Most people tend to talk about financial resources as the main resource. If I don't have finance, I cannot perform. And that's not necessarily true because you have human resources, you have volunteers. You could invest in your volunteers in the initial stages of a project. You can also subcontract. In other words, you can work as a subcontracting organization with a larger charity or even a business organization. And in doing so, you can have what is called a trade-off. In other words, that organization may not have sufficient members or clients, but you may have because of the reach that you have within your community. And therein lies working partnership. And that can help to reduce or alleviate some of the limited capacity you have. Because limited capacity simply means you don't have sufficient room in order to expand the project. And limited capability means that you don't have sufficient people or adequate individuals. So the best way to do this is to work with the more reputable organizations and develop, if you like, your image and reputation gradually. You cannot do it in one go. It has to be incremental, step by step. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you, Doctor, for your input. The next question is kindly share some best practices around sustainability measures with partners or stakeholders.
Well, some of the best practice measures we discussed. One was to engage with stakeholders on a regular basis. We mentioned the word early, meaning that before the project starts, you getting there and you start talking to the various individuals, be they public sector workers, government departments, government personnel, ambassadors, whoever they are, community leaders, faith leaders, you engage with them. That's one of the best practice or practices. The other practice, of course, is to sustain that conversation, not because you didn't receive funding from a donor or a stakeholder, it means that you don't want to talk to that person. Try to develop a relationship, a professional relationship, even a friendship. Attend their events. Invite, ask to speak at these events as well so that people can know who you are and who you represent. Take notes, give them feedback. If you attend an event, a formal event, you write them. You write them on Facebook, you write them on LinkedIn, you send an email or a thank you card or a message. So you act human because this is about human relations. And more importantly, always show interest in what the stakeholders are doing, even if it is not something that is part of your charity. So you may have a stakeholder that is an environmentalist, and you may be doing an education project on technology, but therein lies the association between technology and the environment. So engage with that environmentalist stakeholder, and you can learn so much from what that person is doing. The final bit that I would like to put forward here is make sure that you are learning NGO. Every day you should try to learn something new. And that is the only way I think you'll be able to progress as an organization. The more you learn, the less problems you will have as an organization. And that is how you can sustain your organization for a very, very long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Dear participants, due to time limitations, we cannot cover all the questions posted here. As now we have reached the end of the webinar, I want to thank each one of you for your active participation. Participants, please take a moment to fill out the feedback form for today's session. Your input is crucial in helping us to improve. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to contact us at support@fundsforngos.org. The feedback form will appear on your screen in a moment. Once again, thank you, Dr. Christopher.
You're most welcome.
And to all the participants, we look forward to seeing you in our next webinars. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.